And now crossing live to Peter Kuznick himself, a professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University in Washington. Professor, I'm glad to have you join me right now. So let me start with this. Can you share with us what was the most important point of your discussion with Tucker Carlson and Oliver Stone?
Oliver and I went on. Let me explain this. I have a former student who's a Trump insider, and I was having lunch with him, and I asked him what was the best way to influence Trump's foreign policy. And he said to either go on the Tucker Carlson show or the Joe Rogan show. So Oliver and I decided we would follow that up and go on Tucker Carlson's show with the hopes that Donald Trump would be listening. He recently, that same morning, we were on in the afternoon, he's interviewed Jeff Sachs in the morning. They put that up very quickly, and Donald Trump has now tweeted out or put out over his Truth Social network the interview, or part of the interview with Jeff Sachs. So we know he's listening. And what we want to warn about is how dangerous the global situation has become. Not only Ukraine, not only Gaza, but also Taiwan and the South China Sea. Any one of these crises could develop quickly into the kind of crisis that could trigger a broader war and potentially a nuclear war. And so there's been more discussion of nuclear war as a serious possibility in the last few months than there's been in years, maybe decades, since the 1960s and the Cuban Missile Crisis. We want to avert that. We want to end the wars. We want to see diplomacy being foregrounded again. And we want to make sure that the insane people who are planning for nuclear war do not get traction.
All right, talking about nuclear war, because this is an issue that has been discussed not only in the United States, but even countries around the world. Now, the interview started with a question about how close the world is to a nuclear war. What do you think about the doomsday clock currently being at 90 seconds to midnight? Can you specifically break these things down for us?
Well, the doomsday clock was moved from 100 seconds to midnight to 90 seconds before to midnight. I thought it should be put at 60 seconds to midnight. Given how much more dangerous the world has become over the past year, I thought it should be moved much closer to midnight than it was. So I disagreed with their evaluation. Russia keeps drawing red lines, and the United States keeps crossing them on the assumption that Russia is not going to, that Russia's just bluffing, that Putin is not going to follow through on his threats. Well, I think that that's a fool's game, really, because at some point, we know what happens. You can draw a red line and then not act when it's crossed once. Maybe you can do so twice. But beyond that, to think that Russia will repeatedly not respond when the U.S. crosses its clearly stated red lines is gambling with the future of life on this planet. And I don't think that gamble is something that should be considered.
All right, Tucker Carlson mentioned that he sees no reason for the West to be at war with Russia. Now, just today, we see yet another massive sanction package from the Biden administration against Moscow. Now, what do you think about those conflicting views, Carlson on one hand and the Biden administration on the other?
Tucker Carlson is not somebody who I agree with when it comes to issues of immigration, replacement theory, a lot of racial issues, a lot of social issues we don't agree on. What we do agree on is the insanity of the current threat of war and the insanity of provoking Russia on the assumption that they're not going to respond. We also agree on the danger of U.S. militarization of the Pacific, not responding to or recognizing China's red lines, But we're concerned because Trump, to his credit, is saying that we need to end the war in Ukraine. What we don't want to see is this fighting continue. And a year from now, Russia will have more Ukrainian territory, and there will be hundreds of thousands more dead and wounded on both sides. And we're still going to have to end this with a negotiated settlement. But our concern is we don't want to see the war in Ukraine ended and then Trump turn against Iran or against China. But what we want to see is diplomacy broadly across the board, figuring out ways to peacefully resolve these crises and work together to solve the world's real issues that affect all of us.
All right, how do you think Donald Trump's return to the White House will affect world politics, and in particular, the relationship between Russia and the United States?
I think that Trump will look to cut deals with countries around the world. Trump does not see Russia as an implacable enemy the way many NATO countries do. So I'm optimistic that Trump will look for a diplomatic solution in Ukraine. However, I was in Russia several times before the 2016 election. And in many of these cases, I was the only one at a conference who argued that Hillary Clinton, as much as I disagreed with her, would end up being better for Russia than Trump was. And my friends disagreed with me, but then many of them later said I was right. You have to remember that it was Trump who gave the lethal aid to Ukraine after Obama refused to do so. Obama said that would be a mistake, that Ukraine is so much more important for Russia's national security than it is for America's. So he refused to give lethal aid. Trump also increased the sanctions on Russia. So I don't see Trump as a friend of Russia. I don't see him being in Putin's pocket the way a lot of people in the West do. But I see him as willing to make deals. He doesn't have any fixed values. He doesn't have any strong beliefs, which means that he could either be worse, dramatically worse, or he could be dramatically better. The reason why we go on Tucker Carlson is to try to encourage the side of Trump that looks for peaceful solutions rather than the side that's a bully, that's a militarist, that almost got us to war against Iran, that almost got us to nuclear war against North Korea. I mean, there's that side of Trump also, but there's another side, and that's what we're trying to appeal to.
All right, now, with Trump's rhetoric about taking Greenland and his overall views about forcing NATO member states to increase their defense spending, some observers think that NATO could be teetering on the brink of dissolution or even an implosion. What are your thoughts in this regard?
I mean, the Greenland thing and the Panama and Canada and the Gulf of America are typical Trumpian insanity. However, there is a certain rationale behind the Greenland one. Now, the danger, of course, is that if the U.S. used force against Greenland, then Greenland would invoke, or Denmark would invoke Article 5 of the NATO Charter, and all of the NATO countries would be obligated to come to Denmark and Greenland's defense against the United States, which is almost laughable in the absurdity of that situation. However, U.S. does want, there seems to be indications, the U.S. would like to use not only the anti-ballistic missile systems in Greenland, but possibly even put nuclear weapons in Greenland. And Denmark has said no. Greenland also has a lot of minerals. It has oil and gas. It has a U.S. military base. So there are, and then it's got some of the Arctic sea lanes are opening up as the ice cap melt. So Greenland does have strategic significance. But Trump, this is not the 19th century, and you can't go around forcing countries or threatening countries into giving up their territory. So this is Trumpian bluster. It could be his negotiating ploy. It could be staking out a maximalist position so that he can then try to come to a more minimalist agreement. But it's dangerous. This is not the time. Yeah, when the NATO meeting was going on in Washington, Narendra Modi went to Moscow to meet with Putin, and he said, "This is not a time of war. This is not an era of war." Sadly, in reality, it is an era of war. There are major wars going on around the planet. But he's right that it should not be an era of war. That's why we need to find ways. We need to figure out how we're going to live in a multipolar world, in a multicultural world. There's no longer, the United States is no longer the unipolar power that can dictate to the rest of the world. We see the BRICS coalition emerging and offering alternatives. We see the global South refusing to go along with U.S. sanctions against Russia. We see a shift in global geopolitics, and we've got to turn that in a positive direction.
All right. Now, in that interview, you also discussed how Democrats have turned from a prosperity party into a war party. Now, what's the main driver behind this transition? And could the party reform itself now that it has lost the presidential election?
There are progressives still in the party. Bernie Sanders has been sounding the alarm on a lot of this. But what we've seen with the Democrats, sadly, and I usually vote for the Democrats, is that they've become more and more of a corporate party. And the corporate influence has curbed the pro-working class instincts of the Democratic Party and the anti-war instincts of the Democratic Party, which is tragic to me. And so we see more and more neoconservative influence in the Democratic Party. This has been going on for a while. I've been doing a lot of interviews about Jimmy Carter lately. And the last 2 years of the Carter presidency, we saw Jimmy Carter, who had good instincts and was anti-war, wanted to abolish nuclear weapons. By the end of that presidency, he was really reading from Zbigniew Brzezinski's anti-communist, anti-Soviet playbook. We saw then that double down on during the Clinton administration. And Obama, who had good instincts, did not have a backbone. But Biden has been completely taken over by warlike interests. And even more egregious than Ukraine is Biden's blanket support for Israel in this slaughter in Gaza right before the world's eyes, which is making the United States look completely hypocritical on the world stage. On the one hand, condemning what Russia is doing in Ukraine, on the other hand, arming, sanctioning, and apologizing for what Israel is doing in Gaza. You can't have it both ways. I mean, you have to be opposed to war and military solutions and in favor of development, peaceful development, and dealing with the real problems that the world has. And Biden has really missed the ball on this one.
All right, we have to leave you here now. Peter Kuznick, a professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University in Washington. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
My pleasure. It's good to talk to you.
Right.